The stage was set. A perfect circle, 20 meters in diameter, had been cut from a single slab of imported stone and constructed so that one end touched the floor while the other was held 10 degrees above it by concealed anti-grav generators. This was the Canted Circle. Known only to members of the Order, which throughout its long history had never numbered more than 500 in any given period, and was housed in the clear domed summit of the Esoteric Society's monad in the heart of Coruscant's Forbosi District. Legend had it that the round-topped building, thought to be one of the oldest in that part of the planet, was built over an ancient lake bed and had been the sole survivor of a seismic event that had tipped it 10 degrees to the southwest. A century after the quake, the structure had been righted to vertical, except for the central portion of the canted floor of its uppermost story, which later supplied the name for a clandestine organization founded by the influential beings who had purchased the building sometime during the reign of Chancellor Tarsus Valorum. Just then, Larsh Hill, draped in black robes, was standing at the raised end of the circle, and Plagueis, 114D, and 10 other Muuns, also wearing black garments, though different from the Order's hooded garb, stood at the other. Scheduled to begin at the top of the hour, the initiation ceremony would commence with the high official joining Hill on the circle, initiating him and placing around his neck the Order's signature pendant. Plagueis had declined an offer of enrollment 20 years earlier, but had continued to do business with the Grand Mage and many of the Order's most prominent members, several of whom were regulars at the gathering on Sojourn. The Order of the Canted Circle was content to serve as an exclusive club for some of the galaxy's most influential beings. Its aims were narrow in focus and its rituals universally allegorical, replete with secret phrases and handshakes. Plagueis understood the need to instill members with a sense of furtive fraternity, but he couldn't risk having the high officials dig too exhaustively into his background. Larsh Hill's past, on the other hand, was exemplary. Even the decades he had spent working with Plagueis' father, Damask. Once initiated, Hill would become Damask Holdings' principal agent on Coruscant, and his son, San, would become Hego's right hand in preparation for his eventual role as chairman of the intergalactic banking clan. Returned from the short holo communication with Sidious, Plagueis was filled with a sense of triumph. Before night fell on the Forbosi District, the members of the Gran Protectorate would cease to be of concern. Pack's team and the rest believed they had found shelter aboard one of Coruscant's orbital facilities, but the Sun Guards, save for a pair Plagueis had kept in reserve in the Order's initiation room, were on the way to them now, in forces sufficient to crush whatever defences Santhe security might be providing. Sidious had played his part perfectly, and had redeemed himself fully in Plagueis' eyes. The time had come to bring his apprentice deeper into the Sith mysteries he had been investigating for most of his life, to introduce him to the miracles he was performing on Abora. From a series of arched-topped doorways lining the circumference of the room came the sounds of solemn chanting, as perhaps 36 of the Order's black-robed members began to file in and take their places along the perimeter of the Canted Circle. Last to emerge was the High Official, who wore a mask and carried the circular, emblematic pendant draped over both hands, which he held as if in prayer. Rituals of a similar sort had been enacted by the ancient Sith, Plagueis thought, as Larsh Hill genuflected before the High Official. At the same instant, Hill's right knee touched the polished stone. A jangle of foreboding laddered up Plagueis' spine. Turning ever so slightly, he saw that 114D had rotated its head toward him in a gesture Plagueis had come to associate with alarm. The dark side fell over him like a shroud, but instead of acting on impulse, he restrained himself, fearful of betraying his true nature prematurely. In that instant of hesitation, time came to a standstill and several events happened at once. The high official gave a downward tug to the pendant he had placed around Hill's neck, and the old Muuns' head toppled from his shoulders and began to roll down the tipped stage. Blood geysered from Hill's neck, and his body fell to one side with a thud and began to jerk back and forth as one after another of his hearts failed. Yanking their hands from the roomy opposite sleeves of their robes, the hooded members of the Order made sidelong throwing motions which sent dozens of decapitator discs screaming through the air. Muuns to both sides of Plagueis fell to their knees, their last breaths caught in their throats. A disc buried deep in his forehead, one of the Sun Guards twirled in front of Plagueis like a crazed marionette. Blood fountained, turning to mist. Struck in at least 3 places and leaking lubricant, 114D was trying to limp to Plagueis' side when another disc whirled into its alloy body, touching off a storm of sparks and smoke. Plagueis pressed his right hand to the right side of his neck to discover that a disc had made off with a considerable hunk of his jawbone and neck, and in its cruel passing had severed his trachea and several blood vessels. He cupped the force against the injury to keep himself from lapsing into unconsciousness, but he fell to the floor regardless, with blood pumping onto the already slick stone circle. Around him, slanted in his faltering vision, the assassins had drawn vibroblades from the other sleeves of their robes and were beginning a methodical advance on the few Muuns who were still standing. A hail of bolts streaked from the blaster cradled in the arms of the remaining Sun Guard, sweeping 6 hooded beings off the rim of the circle before he himself was butchered. Tricked, Plagueis thought, as pained by the realization as he was by the wound. Outmaneuvered by a group of inferior beings who at least had had some sense enough to place artfulness above arrogance. Slumped on his right side, knees drawn up to his chest, eyes open but unmoving, Plagueis watched the second Echani succumb to multiple stabs from the assassin's vibroblades. With blood welling out from under Plagueis' cupped right hand and glistening in a pool on the floor beneath his neck, they had taken him for dead. But now they were moving from the body of one fallen Muun to the next, checking for signs of life and finishing what they had begun. A few had lowered their black hoods, revealing them to be Maladians, the same group of aliens Sidious had employed to assassinate Vidar Kim. For an instant he wondered if Sidious had secretly taken out a second contract, but he immediately dismissed the thought, born as it was of his not wanting to admit to himself that the Gran had bested him. He wondered if the Maladians had actually been bold enough to kill the prominent Canted Circle members they were impersonating. Unlikely, given that the assassins were known and respected for their professionalism. The members had probably been rendered unconscious by gas or other means. Not a meter away stood 114D, 5 decapitated discs protruding from his alloy body and telltale lights blinking in the midst of a self-diagnosis routine. Having run himself through a similar test, Plagueis knew that he had lost a great deal of blood and that one of his subsidiary hearts was in fibrillation. Sif techniques had helped him perform chemical cardioversions on his two other hearts, but one of them was working so hard to compensate that it too was in danger of becoming arrhythmic. Plagueis moved his eyes just enough to fix the locations of some of the 24 assassins that had survived the Sun Guards' counterattack. Then he dug deep into the Force and catapulted himself to his feet. The closest of the assassins swung to him with raised vibroblades and rushed forward, only to be flung backward off the canted stage and against the room's curved walls. Others Plagueis felled with his hands by snapping necks and putting his fists through armoured torsos. Spreading his arms wide, he clapped his hands together, turning every loose object in the vicinity into a deadly projectile. But the Maladians were far from run-of-the-mill murderers. Members of the cult had killed and wounded Jedi, and in response to confronting Force powers, they didn't shrink or flee, but simply changed tactics, moving with astounding agility to surround Plagueis and wait for openings. The wait lasted only until Plagueis attempted to unleash lightning. His second subsidiary heart failed, paralyzing him with pain and nearly plunging him into unconsciousness. The assassins wasted not a moment, throwing themselves at him in groups, though in a vain attempt to penetrate the force shield he raised. Again he rallied, this time with a ragged sound dredged from deep inside that erupted from him like a sonic weapon, shattering the eardrums of those within 10 meters, and compelling the rest to bring their hands to their ears. In blinding motion, his hands and feet smashed skulls and windpipes. He stopped once to conjure a force wave that all but atomized the bodies of 6 Maladians. He spun through a turn, dragging the wave halfway around the room to kill a half a dozen more. But even that wasn't enough to deter his assailants. They flew against him again, making the most of his momentary weakness to open gashes on his arms and shoulders. Down on one knee, he levitated a Sun Guard blaster from the floor and called it toward him. But one of the assassins succeeded in altering its trajectory by hurling himself into the path of the airborne weapon. With nothing more than the force of his mind, Plagueis rattled the floor, knocking some of the assassins off their feet. But others rushed in to take their places, slashing at him with their vibroblades from every angle. He knew that he had life enough left to conjure one final counter-offensive. He was a moment from unleashing death upon his assailants when he sensed Sidious enter the room. Sidious and Saint Pestige, in whose hands a repeating blaster brought swift death to the rest of the Maladian assassins. Hurrying to Plagueis' side, Sidious lifted him upright, and in unison they brought swift death to the rest.